Hey guys, what's up? So, like I promised, I wanted to go over some of the questions that I got last week in one of my posts on Instagram. So, if you guys have any other questions, please go to my Instagram and just send me a private message. And I'm gonna try and start doing some of these videos on a probably weekly to maybe bi-weekly start. So, I chose 5 different questions and I'm going to answer them today. So, the first question I got was, if targeting longer distances, does it make sense to work on speed or endurance first? So this comes down to a programming question, which I really enjoy programming questions just because I feel like I understand kind of the very, very dirty basics of programming. So I don't know what you mean by longer distances. So I coach up pretty much to the 400. I will dabble with a few like 400, 800 mixes of athletes, but primarily my coaching, I'm coaching the sprinters, the power athletes up to the 400 meters. So if you're coaching a 400 meter athlete or anything below 200, 400, 400, 800, 100, 200, jumpers, all that stuff. You have to figure out what does that athlete exactly need. So each of those groups need a little bit different training because of how much of their different systems, like their lactic acid system, like their anaerobic system, all those systems they're going to use to different percentages. So your high jumper is really not going to go into their lactic acid system ever. I mean, maybe if you're in a jump off and you are jumping and not giving the amount of rest, but really with the rules in track and field, you're not really going to hit that issue. But then if you look at your 400 runner, they're going to need to train in their lactic acid system because you're going to hit a wall at some point in the 400, like most people know. So going into, obviously everybody's a little different in what their events are, but let's say we're going to talk about the 400 meter athlete right now. I train speed first with all of these groups because if you don't have speed, how can you have speed endurance? So you can train endurance, like general endurance, but most of the athletes from the 400 and below don't really need a whole lot of general endurance. They're maybe tapping into the aerobic system like a little bit, but not very much. And that's like, I'm gonna say there's not really a big point and emphasis to put on the general fitness and that aerobic system capacity. So what you really wanna train is speed first, and then start to go into those special endurance workouts and their speed endurance workouts, because that's where you're going to see the improvement. If you try and train speed endurance before speed, you're just gonna get very frustrated because your athletes aren't gonna hit the rep times that you're asking them to hit, and then you're back at square zero. So you have to train speed first, teach them how to be fast, and then teach them how to be fast for longer periods of time, which is where that speed endurance tactic is getting into. So that's how I train and kind of program my athletes out from an off-season to preseason to competition season program and block, which we'll get into with the next question is, what does an off-season week look like for a sprinter? And this is a really good question because right now I've kind of been fumbling around with what I need to do differently because right now we're in this coronavirus pandemic and they didn't get an outdoor season, and normally I give them about 4 to 6 weeks to kind of do whatever they want to do, and I don't give them specific training before we start our off-season training. I know 90% of my athletes don't do anything during that time. Now, with this pandemic and having outdoor season canceled, a lot of them have already had 6 to 8 weeks where they've done nothing. So where do we start with, and how long of a time period do we need to get to our goals and where we want to be. So those are always the questions that you have to ask. And I know every single coach has to deal with a little different schedule, a little different, different athletes, depending on if they're coming from other sports and coming in later and stuff like that. So that all matters. But where my big mindset shift that I want to get into for the off-season training for a lot of the sprinters and jumpers is a lot of coaches, and this comes from that old mindset of the 2-a-day practices, that getting in shape mindset, which is a good mindset for certain athletes, like our endurance athletes, like our distance athletes that do need to get into that aerobic shape. But remember, like we talked in the last question, our 400-meter athletes barely tap into their aerobic system, and as we get lower and lower into the 200, 100 jumpers, they probably never hit their aerobic system unless we have a weird sort of event happen in a track meet. So what I like to kind of talk about is more getting into a functional base. So functionally, what do these athletes need? They need acceleration, they need to learn speed, they need to learn strength and absolute strength. They need to learn elasticity and how to change and go into that plyometric strength. So those are the big 4 things that I think should be the focus of an off-season training program. Now, again, for an entire team, normally what I would do is kind of break these up. So you'll have a strength day, you'll have a plyometric day, you'll have an acceleration day, you'll have a speed day, and break that up into a week. If we want to get really down and dirty and individualize this to certain specific athletes, maybe one athlete you have, her big weakness is strength. She really could get a lot stronger. Her speed's pretty much there. Obviously, you're still going to need to work on it, but maybe you have 2 to 3 days where you're working on strength, and then you're putting in the acceleration, the plyometric, and the speed days around those strengths. So I always say, if you can, individualize it for the athlete so that you're getting the best out of that program for that specific athlete. But I get it. I'm a college coach. There's no way in heck that I can individualize every single one of my athletes' programming because I also work full time. So that's a tough deal. But if I could, I absolutely would. So that's kind of how I would train for off season, is look at those functional bases of the speed, the acceleration. You don't need to do miles. Nowhere ever do I have a 400-meter runner go on miles, unless, again, if for their recovery day, you know what, that gets them relaxed and that gets their stress levels down and that gets them the best recovery that they want, then absolutely. Again, we always need those recovery days in there. And now I'm getting off on a soapbox, but recovery should be different for every athlete depending on what they need to recover. Maybe recovery can look like a bunch of different forms, whether it's sleep, whether it's nutrition, whether it's diet, whether it's those stress levels. All of that plays into how well an athlete recovers. So being able to individualize that to an athlete of saying, oh, you know what, you really respond to yoga very well, so your recovery days are going to be primarily yoga. You respond to going on a long distance run to decrease that stress, then we look at that. So there's all different options that you can put into your recovery days that, again, are still in that off-season training program. Everybody needs rest days, and that's an important factor that some athletes and coaches don't understand and run their athletes into the ground. So never ever run your athletes into the ground. One of my coaches that I worked under for a long period of time always said, train to live another day. And I think that is a huge and incredibly important quote, that you have to train to live another day, or else there is no training and there is no competition after that. So always remember that your rest and recovery is extremely important as well. All right, back on track. So our next question is how to train for the high jump at home. It's funny seeing all these different videos of people high jumping into their pools and high jumping onto their beds. And I think it's very creative and fun that during this hard time that we don't know what the heck is happening and what's going on, people are still being able to be creative and have fun. But yeah, I get it's tough to train for the high jump at home when you don't have a high jump mat and a high jump bar. Same with our long and triple jumpers. If you don't have sand pits, it's kind of tough to land in the sand. Pole vaulters and everything like that. So I get everybody is having to either one, become creative, or two, remember, this is going to go back into that last question that we had. Right now, pretty much all of our athletes are training for an off-season program right now. There might be some track events that'll happen in the summer, but really I wouldn't put my focus to that because we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen in the summer. If we do get a chance to compete, awesome. But right now, I think we should go back to building off of our weaknesses and off of that functional base. So again, if we know speed is our issue, if we know we have a technical error in, say, our acceleration phase, then put 3 days of focus to your acceleration phase and then work in those strength and the speed and the plyometric days in between that. So that's how, again, high jumpers, you're gonna need speed, you're gonna need your elastic strength a lot. You're gonna need your acceleration from the start of your run. So you're gonna need all that stuff. So building all that stuff is probably the way that I would go for a high jumper at home right now. The one thing that I will say that's a little bit different about a high jumper than most of the events in track and field is you have to train in multiple planes. So a lot of times we say a big difference in track and field athletes is we run in a straight line 90% of the time. Yes, we run around the track, I get that. But 90% of the time we are running forward in the sagittal plane, which this is what I would call the sagittal plane. So there's 3 planes that you can kind of train in and get your body to adapt and be able to respond to forces in these 3 planes. So the first one is sagittal, and most of your track and field athletes are going to primarily need to train in the sagittal plane. The next is frontal plane, which means moving side to side. You'll have some of that with the curve, leaning in the curve, but your high jumpers are actually going to have a lot more of that because of that curve. And then they're going to also have a transverse force where they have to rotate around the bar, which comes from that centripetal force. So they actually have to train in all 3 planes. Our throwers would be a big one that have to train in the transverse plane because they're going around in a circle. But yeah, a lot of your athletes, like your long and triple jumpers, are primarily just going to be in that sagittal plane. They might have a little bit in the frontal and transverse plane, but really 90% of their strength and their forces are coming in the sagittal plane, whereas the high jumper is different. So that's another aspect when you think about creating your absolute strength and creating that elastic strength with your plyometrics is think training in all 3 of these planes. So just to give you an example, in the sagittal plane would be like a forward backward jump, front back jump. A frontal plane would be like a skater jump or a side to side jump. And then a transverse plane might be like a 180 twist, or a lot of times I'll do like broad jump plus twist to learn how they can take off, or doing like a single leg 90-degree turn. For a high jumper is a common plyometric that I'll use. So those are some examples of how to train in those different planes. So that's something that you could also look into of how to train for the high jump at home. I've created a few different circuits that you can do from home for a high jumper, for a long and triple jumper, for our sprinters, and they are available on my website. If you go into if you go into the Instagram page and go into my bio, it's linked in there. If you have any use for that right now. I know hopefully we'll soon be outside and being able to train like normal athletes, which I'm hoping as well too. So, okay. 2 more questions. So the next one would be, how can I keep my feet low when coming out of the blocks? And I chose this question because it is such a common question. And it's a popular topic because some of the elite athletes are doing it. So why shouldn't all of we be doing it, right? But where I would like to kind of turn that question around is, why are you asking that question? What's the purpose of keeping your feet low? Is that really your goal of your start? No, your goal is to get out the fastest that you can compared to all of your competitors in the other lanes. So really, yes, one of the ways to come out quickly is keeping your feet low, but there are plenty of other athletes that can come out fast with not keeping their feet low. So a lot of what I don't really focus on athletes keeping their feet low coming out of the blocks. I focus on their power and I focus on their angles of how they're coming out of the blocks. So when you come out of the blocks, your force, your ground, the ground reaction force, which is pretty much comes from one of Newton's laws, that whatever force that you put in the ground is going to give you that force back. And when we're sprinting, what we want the ground to give us is as much force as we can towards the finish line, so we get there the fastest. So when you come out of the blocks, you want, when your front foot hits, you want as much force to come down and hit this ground so the ground can give that same force back. And if we want to look at physics, technically these arrows would be even to show that it's giving the same force back in that direction. So one, we want to be able to give the maximum amount of force towards the finish line, okay? And then the other component is we want to be able to make that force as quickly as possible, which becomes that power word. So force, power is force over time. How quickly can you create that force? So that's all what this start is about. I don't care if you create the best power with the highest ankles and feet and your feet don't stay low. Guess what? I don't give a shit. You won that race. But if you are keeping your feet low, great. That is a way. Like, I'm not saying it's wrong to keep your feet low, but what I'm saying is we need to look at this term and not put such a focus on just keeping the feet low. We need to put a focus on the speed and the force that your legs create coming out of the blocks, or your whole body, because your arms are play a huge part in it as well. So what you want is really your legs to be as quick as possible and as forceful as possible to come down and create this force down and back, so the ground is going to help push you to the finish line. So that's where I take that question of how do you keep your feet low? I don't focus on that. I focus on the forceful and powerful block starts. So that's where I would go with that. Last question, which again kind of goes with that sprinter mindset, is how to properly switch between your drive phase and your top speed. I wish it was like a light switch where you turn on and turn off, but it's not. You have to slowly transition to that. And again, this all has to come down to those angles and those ground reaction forces. So if you all of a sudden are in your drive phase like this guy here, and then you pop up the next step and you're up and down, my pen doesn't work very well. and you're up and down, your force just, instead of gradually, slowly starting to work your way out of these, and so your momentum is then taking you forward, you just went from this ground reaction force to this ground reaction force, which is going to then halt your speed and not allow you to come up to your top speed the fastest. So it has to be a slow transition. So I always kind of explain to my athletes that you should have a drive phase of keeping your head down, keeping your power coming out of those first few blocks and first few steps, and really focusing on that acceleration phase and that drive phase. And then you should slowly start to transition up. So it shouldn't be, and a lot of how I teach that transition phase is really just from the head, because a lot of our arms and our leg movements will respond to what our head does. So if your head all of a sudden is down, looking down, okay, coach said 30 meters, I can stand up, boop, I'm up. That's the wrong way to transition into your top speed. So really it should kind of be that slow. Okay, I've hit that 25, 30 meter mark. I don't think I can hold this drive phase for much longer. Let's slowly bring your eyes up towards the finish line, and that will help that transition be a much slower process. Some of the drills that I'll use are called cobras, where you're moving from your drive phase to your transition and top speed, back to your drive phase, back to your top speed phase. So kind of working in and out of those phases, which I won't use till competition season and almost peaking season, because I feel like a lot of times we're still trying to learn all the other phases first. Now, remember, I coach at a Division III level, so I'm not dealing with complete elite athletes. I'm dealing with some great athletes, but not elite athletes that I have to work on some of those functional bases for a longer period of time, especially if I have a younger class coming in. If the prime majority of my team is freshman and sophomore and they're the younger class, maybe I'm putting a much bigger emphasis to absolute strength and elastic strength for maybe a whole year. And we're using it as a building phase, because if you can't build on top, remember, I read this in a book, you can't be at the highest without the lowest. So think of your pyramids. This is your functional base. You need to make sure you build your functional base before you go into your speed endurance, before you go into all your technical stuff. Because if you can't hold your block start because of strength, then no matter how many times you practice that darn block start, you're not going to get anywhere, because you need to build this functional base and be able to have that elastic strength out of the blocks, be able to have that strength to hold your blocks, your set position in your blocks, all of that stuff. So it all builds on top of each other. That's why I think that functional base of building that speed, building those accelerations, doing all that, having the proper form while running is super important. And that's where I feel like a lot of coaches and athletes can get very frustrated, because if I'm a coach and I'm saying the same critique over and over and over again to the same athlete, that's triggering a thing in my mind that, okay, there's something else going on underneath of that. So if I'm saying something about their block start of saying, hey, you need to keep your hips higher in your set position, and they just can't get into that position, or they can't hold it for as long as the starter holds them in that set position, I have to go back down and look further down in that base of seeing, okay, well, why? Why can't they do that? Maybe it is an absolute strength issue. Maybe it is a flexibility issue. Maybe it's a mobility issue. Kind of looking into all of those aspects and looking deeper into that functional base to where these mistakes or issues are popping up that we're trying to correct. Because if we're saying the same thing over and over again, all it's going to do is create frustration for both me, the coach, and the athlete, which is never a good situation. So always, if you find yourself, and trust me, I'll do it, I'll find myself repeating the same phrase over and over and over again, and then I go, oh, light bulb, what's going on here? Something else has to be causing this issue that just a verbal correction isn't going to make the difference. It has to come from maybe a strength issue in the weight room. Maybe it's coming from a plyometric issue. Maybe it's coming from a speed issue. Maybe it's coming from the flexibility issue. Looking at all of those avenues to find how to correct these issues is the really important thing. So those were the 5 questions, but I also got a really fun question that I figured I would answer too. What rule would you change in track and field? And I thought about this one actually for probably way longer than I should have, because one of the, of course, you think of like all the different, I remember we were talking like this season, if you had a chip for jumps, instead of having to take off the board, you just took off from wherever and you jumped, and the chip would kind of know where your foot was, and then landing in the sand would measure your distance. Well, then that takes all of the accuracy out of your runway and how to be accurate and be consistent on the runway. So at one point, yeah, that would be a really cool rule to change, but at the same point, it would change the dynamic of track and field like so big. But one of the rules that I actually got really annoyed with this year was I have a fairly good triple jumper that likes to jump off of a 36-foot board, and 99.9% of the meets that we went to this year would not allow us to have a 36-foot board. And they always make this rule based on the majority of the athletes in the field. Whereas I was talking with another coach at one of the regional meets, literally the meet before nationals, we could not get a 36-foot board, which blows my mind. But we were talking, and we said, really, this rule should be designed around the top athletes. So instead of, I get that there should be 2 boards. Okay, that's fine. If we had 3 boards, we'd have way too many officials making mistakes. So still have the 2 boards, but allow one of those boards to be picked by the top athletes, and then the majority of the athletes should be able to pick that next board. Because I think it limits some of the top athletes that could really use one of those boards. And I get we want to make the participation important for all the athletes, but there's a point where, to me, it's college athletics, and we should let the top athletes be the top athletes and really excel at their sport like they train to be. So that is the rule that I would change, because it could be an actual rule that is changed. So that is all of the questions for this week. I will probably post another Q&A on my Instagram. If you guys don't follow my Instagram and you're watching this on YouTube, please go follow it. It's trackandfield.physio. And if you follow my YouTube, keep following it. If you have any suggestions of what kind of videos you want, I'm in the process. My summertime is usually, spring to summertime is usually when I'm making a lot of my newer videos, because it's when I have a little bit more time on my hands that I can make the videos. So if you guys have suggestions of what you guys want me to talk about and different videos, I would love the suggestions, because I'll start making a list and I'll start making all of those new videos for this coming year. So yeah, and I hope everyone is doing well during this unprecedented time. So cheers.